The night the Duke of Ashford stood before 60 of England's finest and called Elizabeth Voss asterisk, "The woman who runs my household," 3 people in that ballroom went very still. One of them set down her champagne glass so carefully that it made no sound at all. One of them turned toward the wall and pretended to admire a painting. And one of them, Lord Pemberton, who had never in his life been described as a patient man, pressed his hand flat against his wife's arm and held it there, until she stopped him from doing something they would all regret. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the room in her gray dress and her quiet hands and her perfectly arranged face, and she said nothing. She simply looked at the Duke, and then she looked away. By morning, nothing in that house would be the same, but Elizabeth Voss already knew that. She had known it for 2 years. She had been waiting. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Elizabeth had been in the kitchen garden when Mrs. Finch brought it to her. A thick cream envelope with the Ashford seal pressed into the wax, addressed not to Miss Elizabeth Voss, but to the senior household staff. She had read it twice. Then she had folded it neatly and placed it in the pocket of her apron. "Will you be attending?" Mrs. Finch had asked. The old woman's voice was careful, the way it always was when she was trying not to say too much. "Yes," Elizabeth said, "I think I will." The Ashford estate had always been beautiful in autumn. Elizabeth had thought so since she was 7 years old, when her father had first brought her here and set her loose in the library while the men talked in the study. She had read 3 books that afternoon and eaten an entire plate of biscuits that a kind maid had brought without being asked. That library still smelled the same, old paper and cedar, and something she had never been able to name. She noticed it the moment she arrived that evening, walking through the servants' entrance as she had been instructed to do. As she had been told to do. She walked through it without looking at the door. The ballroom was already full when Elizabeth entered through the side passage. Candles everywhere. Ladies in silks. Gentlemen making the particular kind of noise that gentlemen made when they were pleased with themselves and the wine was good. Charles Ashford, the Duke, as everyone called him now, stood at the center of it all like a man who had been born knowing exactly where to stand. He was tall. He was handsome. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's warmth, or so people said. Elizabeth had not yet decided whether they were right. She took her position near the window as she had been instructed. She folded her hands. She waited. She saw Lady Hargrove first. Her cousin was standing near the fireplace in deep blue silk, laughing at something a gentleman beside her had said. Then the laugh stopped. Not suddenly, just stopped, the way a song stops when someone lifts the needle from the record. Lady Hargrove's eyes found Elizabeth across the room and stayed there. Elizabeth gave the smallest possible movement of her head. "Not yet." Lady Hargrove looked away, picked up her champagne, smiled at the gentleman again as though nothing had happened. Elizabeth breathed. Then she saw Lord Pemberton. He was standing near the far door with his wife, and the moment he saw Elizabeth his entire face changed, a flash of something hot and furious that he could no more hide than he could hide his height. He took one step forward. His wife caught his arm. Elizabeth kept her eyes forward. The Duke noticed her at 9:20. She could tell the precise moment it happened, not because he looked at her with any particular recognition, but because he stopped mid-sentence and tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when something does not fit the picture he has constructed in his mind. "Who is that?" his expression said. He excused himself from the group around him and walked toward her. Elizabeth watched him come and kept her face very still and very pleasant and entirely empty of everything she actually felt. "Ah," he said when he reached her. He smiled, the practiced smile of a man who smiled at a great many people every day. "I don't believe we've been introduced properly. I'm Ashford." "I know," Elizabeth said. I am Miss Voss, I manage your household. Something shifted in his expression. Just for a moment, a small confusion, a question forming and dissolving before he could quite catch it. Yes, he said slowly, yes, of course. And then a group of guests approached, and the moment passed, and the Duke of Ashford turned to his company and said, with the ease of a man who says these things 100 times a season, "Allow me to introduce Miss Voss, the woman who runs my household. Terribly capable. I don't know what we'd do without her." 60 heads turned. 3 of them went very still. Elizabeth curtsied. She smiled. She said, "Your Grace is too kind." And across the room, Lord Pemberton pressed his hand flat against his wife's arm and held it there, and Lady Hargrove set her champagne glass down without a sound, and Elizabeth Voss looked at the Duke of Ashford, this man who did not know her, who did not know what he had just done, and she thought, 2 years I have waited. A little longer will not hurt. The evening ended past midnight. Elizabeth was the last of the household staff to leave the ballroom, and the first to arrive back the next morning. She had been up since 5, going through the letters that had accumulated on the hall table during the previous day's preparations. There was one she had not seen before. No seal, no address. Slipped under the door of her small room at the back of the east wing, the room she had been given with the explanation that the better rooms are for guests, naturally. She opened it. One line, in handwriting she would have known anywhere. "We cannot stay silent much longer. H." Elizabeth folded the letter, put it in her pocket beside the invitation she had kept since Tuesday. Then she went to make the Duke's morning tea, as she had been told to do. As she had been told to do. She set the kettle on, and she began to think about which document to show him first. The Duke's study smelled like leather and old smoke, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having needed to question anything. Elizabeth had been in this room exactly once before, 2 years ago, on the day she arrived. A solicitor named Mr. Graves had met her at the door, not the Duke. The Duke had been in the country, she was told. Indisposed, she was told. She would be shown to her room and given her duties, and everything would be explained in time. Everything had not been explained in time. Everything had, in fact, been explained not at all. She stood outside the study door now and listened to the silence inside it. 8 in the morning. The Duke was always in his study by 8. Mrs. Finch had told her that on the first day, the way she told her everything, quietly, carefully, watching Elizabeth's face as she spoke. Elizabeth knocked. "Come." He was at his desk with a cup of tea he had not touched, and a letter he was pretending to read. Elizabeth could tell he was pretending because his eyes were not moving. He looked up when she entered. "Miss Voss." "Your Grace." She came to the center of the room and stopped. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." "I have a full morning." "Yes," she said. "I know I arranged it." A pause. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. Not quite. 5 minutes, he said. Elizabeth reached into the folder she was carrying and placed a single document on the desk in front of him. She stepped back. She folded her hands. She waited. He looked at it. He did not pick it up immediately. He was the kind of man who did not like to appear eager or surprised or in any way uncertain of what was about to happen. Elizabeth had noticed that about him. She noticed most things. Then he picked it up. She watched his eyes move across the first paragraph, then stop, then move back to the beginning. "What is this?" he said. "Your father's estate documents," Elizabeth said. Specifically, the codicil added 3 weeks before his death. She had found them in the 4th month. Not hidden, exactly, more like asterisk placed out of reach. The way you put something on a high shelf when you want to be able to say honestly that you never locked it away. The documents had been in a box in the East Wing archive, behind a collection of old hunting ledgers, inside a leather case that bore her father's initials. R.V. Robert Voss. She had sat on the floor of the archive for a very long time, reading. Her father and the late Duke of Ashford had been friends for 30 years. Quiet friends, the kind who did not advertise the fact because one was a duke and one was a gentleman of comfortable but unremarkable means, and England had opinions about such things. They had met at university. They had written to each other for decades. And when her father's health began to fail, 2 years before Elizabeth arrived at Ashford, he had gone to his oldest friend and they had made arrangements together. The late Duke had died 6 weeks after her father. Charles Ashford had inherited the title at 34, returned from a posting abroad, and found an estate in modest disarray and a household that had gained one unexpected occupant. He had been told she was a housekeeper. Elizabeth had often wondered who told him that. Now she was fairly certain she knew. Co-trustee, the Duke said. He said it the way people say words they have encountered for the first time in a context that makes no sense whatsoever. You are listed here as co-trustee of this estate. Yes. Since when? Since your father signed this document, 2 years and 4 months ago. He set the paper down. He looked at Elizabeth with an expression she could not entirely read, part confusion, part something more careful, more controlled. Why, he said slowly, was I not told this? That, Elizabeth said, is an excellent question. She let it sit there between them for a moment. Then, Mr. Graves managed the paperwork during your transition. I believe you found him very efficient. Graves left my employ 8 months ago. Yes, shortly after I began making certain inquiries. The Duke stood up. He was taller standing than she always expected, though she had seen him standing many times. He walked to the window and looked out at the grounds, the grounds that were also, legally, partly her responsibility, and he was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth began to wonder if he was going to ask her to leave. Instead he said, who paid him? Not a question exactly, more like a man thinking aloud, arriving at a conclusion he did not enjoy. Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned that silence in the right moment was more useful than almost any answer. He turned from the window. Miss Voss. There is something else, she said. She reached into the folder again. She had debated, for several weeks, whether to show him this second piece immediately or to wait. She had decided in the end that waiting was a strategy for people who had not already waited long enough. She placed it beside the first document. He came back to the desk. He looked at it. It was a letter, not an official document, nothing with seals or signatures or legal weight. Just a letter in a woman's handwriting dated 14 months ago. My dear Mr. Graves, it began. I trust you understand the importance of ensuring that certain matters remain undiscovered until after the engagement is announced. The woman in the East Wing must continue to believe her situation is temporary. Should she begin to ask questions, I have every confidence you will find appropriate ways to discourage them. It was signed Lady C**. The Duke read it twice. Then he set it down very carefully, the way you set something down when you are exercising a great deal of control over your hands. Where did you get this? He said. Mr. Graves's clerk, Elizabeth said. He kept copies of a great many things. I believe he considered them insurance. The silence in the room was a different kind now, heavier. Lady Cecily, the Duke said. Not to Elizabeth, to himself, to the window, to some version of the last 14 months that was rearranging itself in front of him whether he wished it to or not. I make no accusations, Elizabeth said, which was entirely true. She did not need to. The letter made them for her. She gathered her folder. She smoothed her dress. She turned toward the door. Miss Voss. She stopped. "Why did you wait?" he said. "If you had this, why did you wait this long?" Elizabeth considered the question. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had asked her since she arrived. "Because I wanted to be certain," she said, "that when I did speak, there would be no possible way to misunderstand me." She left him standing at his desk. The tea had not touched, had gone entirely cold. She was back in the kitchen garden by 9 o'clock, making a list of what needed to be ordered for the week, when Mrs. Finch appeared at her elbow with a look on her face that she recognized. "He rang for his solicitor," Mrs. Finch said. "Good," said Elizabeth. "And Lady Cecily has arrived, unannounced. She's in the front sitting room." Elizabeth wrote down *3 dozen candles and lavender soap, and did not look up. "Offer her tea," she said. "The good kind. She'll want to feel she's won something." Mrs. Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You knew she'd come today." "She always comes when she's frightened," Elizabeth said, "and she frightens easily." She turned the page in her notebook and kept writing. "Miss Voss, said Mrs. Finch, and her voice was strange, softer than usual and a little unsteady. "Your father would have been." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "I know." She did not look up, but she stopped writing for just a moment, with her pen still against the page, and let herself feel it, all the weight of it, the 2 years and the gray dress and the servant's entrance and 60 heads turning in a candle-lit ballroom. Then she finished the list. The breakfast room at Ashford seated 12 comfortably and 20, if nobody minded their elbows. On the morning Lord Pemberton arrived, unannounced, uninvited, and entirely unrepentant about both. It seated 4. The Duke, Lady Cecily, a visiting gentleman from the neighboring estate who had stayed the night, and Lord Pemberton himself, who had apparently decided that knocking was optional. Elizabeth heard it from the corridor. She had been on her way to the linen cupboard. She stopped walking. "Pemberton," the Duke said. His voice had that particular flatness it acquired when he was surprised and did not wish to appear so. "I wasn't expecting you." "No," said Lord Pemberton, "I imagine not." Elizabeth could picture him without seeing him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had never learned to arrange itself into anything other than exactly what he felt. His wife said it was his greatest flaw. Elizabeth had always thought it was his greatest virtue. There was the sound of a chair being pulled out. A brief silence that suggested the visiting gentleman had decided, wisely, that he was urgently needed elsewhere and excused himself with some speed. Then Lord Pemberton said, "That woman you paraded in front of 60 guests 2 nights ago." "I beg your pardon," said Lady Cecily. "I'm not speaking to you," said Lord Pemberton. Elizabeth pressed her back against the corridor wall. "Pemberton," the Duke's voice quiet and careful, "I would ask you to remember where you are." "I remember exactly where I am," Lord Pemberton said. "I am in the house that belonged to James Ashford, who was my father's closest friend for 40 years, and I am looking at the man who introduced Elizabeth Voss to half of English society as a servant. So I will ask you, do you understand what you have done?" A silence. "Miss Voss manages my household." "Her mother," Lord Pemberton said, and his voice was very controlled now, which was somehow worse than when it wasn't, was Catherine Voss Caldwell, of the Hampshire Caldwells. Her grandmother presented at court. Her father sat at this very table for 30 years as an equal and a friend." Nothing from the Duke, nothing from Lady Cecily, which Elizabeth noted. "She is my cousin," Lord Pemberton said. "She is Lady Hargrove's cousin. She was, under the protection of this estate, by the explicit arrangement of your own father, and you have had her scrubbing your floors and ordering your candles for 2 years without once." "That is enough." "It is not nearly enough." "I said that is enough." The silence this time was different, harder. Elizabeth recognized the Duke's tone. She had heard it before, when tradesmen pressed too firmly for payment, or when a tenant brought a complaint he considered beneath his attention. It was the voice of a man whose pride had been struck in a place he had not expected, and who was responding the only way he knew how. With distance, with height, with the particular coldness of someone who does not yet know how to be ashamed. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. Then she picked up the linen she had come for and walked back the way she had come. Lady Hargrove found her in the east wing at noon. She came without knocking. Cousins, Elizabeth had always thought, were either the people who knocked most carefully or not at all, and Helena Hargrove had never knocked in her life. She sat down on the edge of the chair by the window, arranged her skirts, and looked at Elizabeth with eyes that had been red at some point in the last hour and were now very determinedly not. "He didn't apologize," she said. "I know. Pemberton nearly. I heard." Lady Hargrove pressed her lips together. "Elizabeth, this cannot continue." "It won't," Elizabeth said. She was mending a cuff not because it needed mending, but because her hands required something to do. "I need 3 more days." "3 days for what?" "There is something I need from London. I've written to a clerk. When it arrives, we will have everything." "And until then?" "Until then," Elizabeth said, "I would very much appreciate it if Pemberton did not do anything that cannot be undone." Lady Hargrove made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'll do my best. You know how he is." "I know exactly how he is. It's why I love him." Elizabeth bit the thread. How was she when Pemberton spoke? Lady Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Still," she said finally, "very still, the way water goes still before it." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "I thought so." She chose dinner. She had thought carefully about the timing, about whether it should be a private conversation or a public one, whether she should speak to the Duke alone or with witnesses, whether the document should arrive quietly or loudly. She chose dinner because dinner had 60 candles and 3 courses, and because what happened at Ashford's dinner table had a way of becoming what everyone in the county discussed for the following month. She chose it because she had been quiet for 2 years, and she had earned the right to be heard. There were 8 at the table that evening. The Duke, Lady Cecily, Lord and Lady Pemberton, who had been persuaded to stay, or rather, Lord Pemberton had refused to leave until he was satisfied, and Lady Pemberton had decided that if he was staying, she was staying, and that was the end of that. 3 neighboring families who had been invited earlier in the week. And Elizabeth, who appeared in the doorway at 7 o'clock in a dress she had not worn in 2 years, deep blue, her mother's pearls, her spine very straight, and who sat down at the table before anyone thought to tell her not to. She watched Lady Cecily's expression arrange itself into something smooth and cold and careful. She watched Lord Pemberton's wife put a hand on his arm. She watched the Duke look at her, really look at her, the way he had not quite managed to do in 2 years of her living in his house, and she watched him try to decide what to do about it and find that he couldn't. "Miss Voss," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware you'd been." "Forgive me," she said pleasantly. "I should have mentioned it. I hope there is room." There was, of course, room. She had arranged the seating herself. The first course came and went. The second course arrived. Elizabeth waited until the room had settled into the particular comfortable noise of people eating and talking and feeling warm from the wine, and then she reached into the fold of her dress and placed a document on the table. Not in front of the Duke, in the center where everyone could see it. "I wonder," she said, and her voice was very clear and very calm, "if your Grace would be willing to read the highlighted passage, aloud if it isn't too much trouble." The table went quiet. The Duke looked at the document. Something crossed his face. He recognized it, or recognized enough of it to know that whatever came next would require his full attention. Lady Cecily reached for her wine glass. The Duke picked up the document. He read the highlighted passage. His voice was steady, she gave him that. He read it all the way to the end without stopping, which was more than she had expected. The words fell into the silent room like stones into still water. Co-trustee, full authority, to be afforded every courtesy due her station. He set it down. The table was very quiet. Lady Cecily's fork had not moved for 40 seconds. Elizabeth had been counting. The gentleman from the neighboring estate said, "Good Lord," under his breath, and his wife pressed his arm. Lord Pemberton looked at Elizabeth. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. "Well," said Lord Pemberton, and he picked up his wine glass and held it toward her with a steadiness that she knew had cost him a great deal. "There it is." The Duke said nothing. He was looking at Elizabeth. She looked back at him. Her expression was pleasant. Her hands were still. Her mother's pearls caught the candlelight. She waited, as she had always waited, to see what he would do next. He waited until the guests had gone. Elizabeth had expected that. Charles Ashford was not a man who performed his worst moments in front of an audience. That, at least, she had learned about him. Whatever he was going to say, he would wait until the candles had burned low and the carriages had rolled down the drive, and there was no one left to witness it but the people he felt he could afford to wound. She sat in the drawing room after dinner and listened to the house empty itself, one carriage at a time. Lord Pemberton stopped at the door on his way out. He looked at her for a long moment, at the blue dress and the pearls and the very careful way she was holding herself together. "Come home with us," he said quietly. "Tonight you don't have to stay." "Yes, I do," Elizabeth said. He looked like he wanted to argue. His wife touched his elbow. "Tomorrow then," he said, "if you need us. I know where you are." He left, the door closed. The house went quiet. Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap and waited. He came in 20 minutes later. He did not sit. He stood at the fireplace with one hand on the mantel, looking into the fire, and Elizabeth studied his profile in the low light and thought, not for the first time, that he looked very much like a man who had been handed a problem he did not know how to solve and had decided, in the absence of a solution, to be angry about it instead. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me considerably more than that," Elizabeth said. "But an explanation is a reasonable place to begin." He turned. His expression was controlled, that careful, aristocratic control that she had come to recognize as the thing he reached for when he felt most uncertain. "I did not know," he said, "who you were, what the arrangement was. I want to be clear about that." "I believe you," Elizabeth said. He blinked. He had been prepared, she could see, for her not to believe him. "What I am less certain of," she continued, "is what you intend to do about it now that you do know." A pause. "There are legal matters to be resolved," he said. "The trustees, the solicitor." "Yes." "It will take time to untangle." "Yes." "And in the meantime," he stopped, started again. "In the meantime, I think it best if we establish a more appropriate—" "Your Grace," Elizabeth said. Her voice was still pleasant, still even. "I have been patient for 2 years. I am prepared to be patient a little longer. But I would ask that you say, simply and plainly, what it is you actually mean to do." He looked at her. Then he said, "I intend to announce my engagement to Lady Cecily at the end of the month." The fire crackled. Elizabeth did not move, did not blink, did not allow a single thing she felt to cross her face, because she had had 2 years of practice at exactly this, and she was very, very good at it. "I see," she said. "The legal matters are separate from—" "Of course. I want you to understand that the question of the estate—" "Your Grace," she stood, smoothed her dress. "I understand perfectly. Thank you for your time." "Miss Voss." but she was already at the door. The garden was cold. She had not stopped to get her coat. She had not been thinking about her coat, had not been thinking about anything except getting out of that room before she did something she could not take back. The night air hit her like a hand against the cheek, and she stopped walking and stood very still on the path between the rose beds, breathing. The roses were all dead now. It was November. They had been extraordinary in July. She remembered standing at the window and watching the gardeners tend them, thinking that whoever had planted them had known exactly what they were doing. Someone with patience. Someone who understood that beautiful things required time. She had thought about her father that day. She thought about him now. Robert Voss, who had sat at that table for 30 years and called the late Duke his friend, who had trusted that friendship enough to place his daughter, his only daughter, the one thing he had left to give, under its protection, who had died believing she would be all right. She had not cried at his funeral. She had been too busy being practical. There were arrangements to make, letters to write, the long, slow business of closing up a life. And then there was the journey to Ashford, and the introduction to Mr. Graves, and the gray dress, and the servant's entrance, and the kitchen garden. She had not cried at any of it. She was not going to cry now. She was not. Miss Voss. Mrs. Finch was standing at the garden door with a shawl over her arm, and an expression that suggested she had been watching from the window, and had given Elizabeth precisely as long as she could bear to. She crossed the path without waiting for an invitation and placed the shawl around Elizabeth's shoulders. Then she stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The garden was quiet. "He's going to announce the engagement," Elizabeth said. "I heard." "She'll have one then. Everything she arranged, everything she—" Elizabeth stopped, pressed her lips together. "It doesn't matter. The legal claim is separate. Pemberton's solicitor says." "Elizabeth." Mrs. Finch almost never used her name. Elizabeth turned to look at her. The old woman's face was very serious in the low light from the house. Not sad, exactly, more like someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided, finally, that the time for carrying it is over. "There is something I should have told you," Mrs. Finch said. "A long time ago, I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself it would only complicate things." A pause. "I was wrong." Elizabeth waited. "In the first year," Mrs. Finch said, "before he knew who you were, before any of this, he used to ask about your father, His Grace. He'd come into the kitchen in the evenings sometimes when the house was quiet, and he'd sit at the table and he'd ask me things." "What sort of things?" "What he was like, your father, whether they'd been close, him and the late Duke, what he'd said about," she stopped, "about the daughter." Elizabeth was very still. "He asked about you," Mrs. Finch said simply. "Before he knew it was you, he was trying to understand what his father had wanted, why there was a woman in the East Wing that no one would properly explain." She looked down at her hands. "He's not a bad man, Miss Voss. I don't think he's ever been a bad man. I think he was handed a tangle of lies and no thread to pull, and he did the wrong thing with it. And I think," she added more quietly, "that Lady Cecily has been very careful about making sure the right thread never found its way to him." Elizabeth looked at the dead roses. She thought about a man sitting in a kitchen in the evenings, asking questions about a father he didn't know, a daughter he hadn't met, a friendship his own father had never explained. She thought about 2 years, about the gray dress, about 60 heads turning in candlelight. She thought about Lord Pemberton saying, "Come home with us," and how she had said, "I have to stay," and how she had meant it, though she could not have said exactly why. Then she took a slow breath. She stood up straight. "He still has to earn it," she said. Her voice was steady. "Yes," said Mrs. Finch, "he does. All of it, every bit." "Yes." Elizabeth pulled the shawl tighter, looked at the house, at the lit windows, the solid stone of it, the library where her father's portrait hung above the mantel. "Then we do this the proper way," she said. She turned and walked back toward the door. Behind her, Mrs. Finch allowed herself one small, quiet smile that Elizabeth did not see. She wrote the letter to London at midnight. It was short, 3 sentences, precisely what was needed, no more. She sealed it herself and left it on the hall table for the morning post. Then she went to her small room in the east wing and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, in the blue dress with her mother's pearls still around her neck, and she let herself feel it, just for a moment, just in the dark where no one could see all of it. The weight of it, the loneliness of it, the sheer exhausting length of it. 1 minute, she allowed herself 1 minute. Then she took off the pearls and laid them carefully on the table, changed her dress, lay down, closed her eyes. Tomorrow there was work to do. They left before dawn. Lady Hargrove had sent her carriage, not the small one she used for local calls, but the good one, the one with the Hargrove crest on the door and the 2 footmen who stood at the back and made certain people understood that whoever was inside was not someone to be trifled with. Elizabeth had looked at it for a moment when it arrived, and then she had looked at Lady Hargrove, who was already inside with her gloves on, and an expression that said she had not slept and was not going to discuss it. Elizabeth got in. The door closed. The carriage moved. The estate disappeared behind them in the gray November morning, and Elizabeth watched it go and felt something she couldn't quite name, not relief, not grief, something in between. "You should eat," Lady Hargrove said, and produced a small wrapped parcel from beside her. "I had cook prepare something." Helena. "Eat, Elizabeth." Elizabeth ate. They reached London by early afternoon. The clerk's name was Mr. Ames. He had written to Elizabeth 3 weeks earlier in a hand so small and careful it looked like a man trying to take up as little space as possible, which, she supposed, was precisely what he had been doing for the last 2 years. He met them at a coffee house near the Strand, not at any office, which told her everything she needed to know about how frightened he still was. He was older than she had expected, thin. He had the look of a man who had not slept properly in a long time and had made a private accommodation with his conscience that had not entirely taken. He stood when they entered, sat again very quickly, put his hands flat on the table. "Miss Voss," he said, "I wasn't certain you'd come yourself." "Here I am," Elizabeth said pleasantly, and sat down across from him. Lady Hargrove sat beside her and said nothing, which was its own kind of pressure. Mr. Ames had worked for the late Mr. Graves for 11 years. He had copied documents and filed letters, and kept records with the meticulous, invisible competence of a man who understood that his value lay entirely in his discretion. He had been discreet. He had also, as Elizabeth had suspected, kept copies of everything. "Mr. Graves told me it was a family matter," Mr. Ames said. He was looking at the table. "That the young woman that you were a distant relation with an inflated sense of your own claim, that the late Duke had made promises in his final weeks that were not legally sound, that it was kinder in the end to—" He stopped. "I believed him, for a time." "And then," Elizabeth said, "and then Lady Cecily began to involve herself directly." He reached into the case beside him, and I began to understand that it was not a family matter, not in the way he had described. He produced a folder, set it on the table between them. Elizabeth looked at it, did not touch it yet. "What is in there," she said, "that you haven't already sent me?" Mr. Ames was quiet for a moment. "2 things," he said. "The first is a record of payments, from Lady Cecily's private accounts to Mr. Graves over a period of 18 months. He paused. "The amounts are considerable." "And the second?" He hesitated. For a moment he looked almost pained. A man about to put down a burden he had carried too long, who found, at the moment of setting it down, that it had become strangely familiar. "There was a letter," he said, "among your father's papers, addressed to the present Duke, to Charles Ashford specifically. It was never delivered. Mr. Graves held it back. He told me it was irrelevant." A pause. "I did not think it was irrelevant." Elizabeth looked at the folder. "May I?" she said. "It's why I asked you to come," Mr. Ames said quietly. She read it there, at the table in the coffee house, while Lady Hargrove sat very still beside her, and Mr. Ames looked at the window with the focused attention of a man, finding the street outside extraordinarily interesting. Her father's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, the particular slant of it, the way he formed his capital letters, the small habit he had of underlining the last word of any sentence he felt strongly about. "Dear Charles," it began. Not asterisk your grace, not Lord Ashford, just Charles, the easy address of a man writing to someone he had known since boyhood, someone who was not yet a duke and might never be, who was simply a young man whose father happened to be one of his oldest friends. She read it slowly. She read every word. Her father had known he was dying, had known for months before he told anyone, because that was exactly the sort of thing he would do, protecting everyone around him from worry until protecting them was no longer possible. He had gone to the late Duke. They had sat together in this very study, the study that now smelled of Charles Ashford's leather and smoke, and they had made their arrangements. "I am not asking you to provide for her," her father had written. "Elizabeth has never needed providing for. She is more capable than anyone I have ever known, and I say that with all the bias of a father who has watched her all her life and is not remotely objective about it. What I am asking is simpler than that. I am asking you to see her. She will be quiet about her difficulties. She will not complain. She will manage everything that is asked of her and ask very little in return, because that is who she is, and I have sometimes worried that I taught her too well to be self-sufficient. So I am asking you, I am asking your family, your name, the weight of everything Ashford has always meant, to simply look at her, really look, and to treat her accordingly. She deserves to be known, Charles, not managed, not accommodated, known. Your father understands why I am asking this of you specifically. When the time is right, ask him. The time is always right for kindness." "Robert." Elizabeth finished reading. She set the letter down. Lady Hargrove, beside her, made a very small sound and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Outside, London went about its business. Carriages and voices and the smell of coal smoke and the specific gray light of a November afternoon. Ordinary things. The world continuing as it always did, indifferent to the moments that broke people open. Elizabeth sat with her hands in her lap. She was thinking about her father sitting in a study with his oldest friend, ill and tired, and quietly arranging the world as best he could before he left it. She was thinking about the late Duke, who had done everything asked of him, and then died 6 weeks later, before he could explain any of it to his son. She was thinking about a young man returning from abroad to find an estate in disarray, and a woman in the East Wing that no one would explain, and making, in the absence of explanation, the wrong assumption. And she was thinking about Mr. Graves, who had taken this letter and put it in a case in an archive, and told himself it was irrelevant, because a woman named Lady Cecily had paid him considerable money to find it irrelevant. He was trying to understand, Mrs. Finch had said. He was trying to find the right thread. Someone had made very certain he never found it. "Miss Voss," Mr. Ames said carefully, "are you all right?" "Yes," Elizabeth said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Thank you, Mr. Ames. This has been very helpful." "I am sorry," he said, "that I waited so long." Elizabeth looked at him. He was still not meeting her eyes, still fixed on the middle distance, still carrying whatever it was he had been carrying. "You came eventually," she said. "That matters." He nodded once quickly. She picked up the letter, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her chest where she could feel it. The carriage back was quiet for a long time. Lady Hargrove did not ask what the letter said. She waited, which was, Elizabeth had always thought, one of Helena's finest qualities. She knew how to wait in a way that felt like company rather than pressure. It was nearly dark when Elizabeth spoke. "He didn't know," she said. "No. None of it, not who I was, not what the arrangement was, not that the letter existed." She looked out at the darkening countryside. He was handed a house full of lies and no explanation, and Lady Cecily made certain it stayed that way. "Yes. That doesn't excuse 2 years." "No," Lady Hargrove said, "it doesn't. He still has to." "I know." Silence. "I'm not going to show him the letter yet," Elizabeth said. Lady Hargrove turned to look at her. "He needs to choose correctly first," Elizabeth said. "On his own, without my father's voice in his ear telling him to." She paused. "If he can't manage that much, then knowing about the letter wouldn't change anything worth changing." Lady Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Your father," she said finally, "was right about you." "Don't," Elizabeth said, but not unkindly. "He was, insufferably so." Elizabeth almost smiled, almost. The carriage rolled on through the dark, and she kept her hand pressed flat against her coat, against the folded letter inside it, and let herself feel, just for a moment, just in the dark, the particular strange comfort of being known by someone, even someone who was gone. She deserves to be known, Charles, not managed, not accommodated, known. "All right, Papa," she said, very quietly to no one in particular. "I heard that," said Lady Hargrove. "I know," said Elizabeth. They rode the rest of the way home, in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. They arrived back at Ashford close to midnight. The house was lit, more lit than it should have been at that hour. Elizabeth noticed it as the carriage turned up the drive. Candles in the downstairs windows, a lamp burning in the study. Mrs. Finch was waiting at the servants' entrance with her coat still on, which meant she had been watching for them. "Something has happened," Elizabeth said. "It was not a question." "Lady Cecily," Mrs. Finch said, "this afternoon while you were gone." Elizabeth waited. "She went into the archive," Mrs. Finch said. "The East Wing. I saw her come out with papers." Elizabeth was still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Which papers?" Mrs. Finch's expression told her before the words did. Elizabeth took a slow breath. "Lock my room," she said, "tonight, and tell Lord Pemberton first thing tomorrow that we may need him sooner than I thought." She walked into the house. Above her, in the lit study window, she could see the shadow of the Duke moving back and forth. Pacing. The forged document was almost good. Almost. Elizabeth found out about it the way she found out about most things, not through drama or confrontation, but through the quiet, steady accumulation of small details that other people forgot she was paying attention to. The first detail was Lord Pemberton, who arrived at 9 in the morning with his solicitor and an expression like a man who had been given an early Christmas present he had not expected and was trying very hard not to enjoy too much. The second was Mrs. Finch, who placed a cup of tea in front of Elizabeth and said, without preamble, "She filed it yesterday with the county recorder. I have a friend in that office." The third was the document itself, which Lord Pemberton's solicitor spread on the kitchen table with the careful movements of a man presenting evidence he found both damning and faintly impressive. Elizabeth read it. Then she read it again. "She had help," she said. "Yes," said the solicitor, "but not good help." Elizabeth looked at the signature at the bottom. Her own name, rendered in a hand that was close enough to fool someone who had never seen her write, close enough to pass a quick inspection, but not close enough for anything more than that. "The date," she said. "Yes. My father was still alive on that date." "Yes." The solicitor allowed himself a very small, very professional satisfaction. He was, in fact, at a dinner in Hampshire on that specific evening, attended by 14 witnesses, 3 of whom are still living and in excellent health. Elizabeth set the document down. She thought about Lady Cecily going into the archive. She thought about her coming out with papers, the particular set of papers she must have taken, the ones that established Elizabeth's claim most clearly, the ones that had taken Elizabeth 4 months to find. She thought about Lady Cecily sitting somewhere in this house with those papers and a forged signature, and the quiet, methodical confidence of a woman who had never been caught doing anything wrong, and did not believe she was about to start. "How long," Elizabeth said, "before this can be formally presented?" "I can have everything prepared by this afternoon," the solicitor said, "if Lord Pemberton agrees to stand as witness." "Obviously," said Lord Pemberton, who had been silent for approximately 4 minutes, which was something of a record. Elizabeth looked at him. "This afternoon," she said, "not this morning." "Elizabeth." "This afternoon. There are people coming to tea." Lord Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his solicitor. Then he looked back at Elizabeth. "You knew," he said. "You knew she'd do something like this." "I thought she might," Elizabeth said. "When people are frightened and running out of time, they make mistakes they wouldn't otherwise make." She picked up her tea. "I needed her to make one." Lord Pemberton sat back in his chair. "I have spent 2 years," he said with great feeling, "being extremely worried about you." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I'm sorry." "You are not remotely sorry." "No," she agreed, "not remotely." The tea was at 3 o'clock. Lady Hargrove had arranged it, casually, as though the idea had occurred to her only that morning, an informal gathering of neighbors, nothing significant. 4 families from the county, people who had known the Ashford estate for decades, people whose opinion carried weight in the particular way that long-standing local opinion always did, people who would remember what they witnessed. Elizabeth had suggested the guest list. Lady Cecily arrived at 2:30 before anyone else, which Elizabeth had also expected. She wanted the room to herself first. She wanted to arrange things. She was wearing pale green. She looked composed and beautiful and entirely in control of herself. And when she saw Elizabeth in the doorway of the sitting room, she smiled the smile of a woman who believed she had already won. "Miss Voss," she said, "how was London?" "Productive," Elizabeth said. "Thank you for asking." The guests arrived at 3. Tea was poured. The fire was lit. The room filled with the comfortable sounds of a Thursday afternoon in November, cups and conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter from Lord Pemberton's direction, because Lord Pemberton found it genuinely difficult to be anywhere without becoming the loudest person in the room. The Duke sat near the window. He had been quiet all day. Elizabeth had seen him once in the corridor, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher, something complicated moving behind his eyes before he looked away. She had not stopped to analyze it. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't, either way. Lord Pemberton's solicitor arrived at 3:30 with a leather case and the quiet efficiency of a man on professional business. He sat near the door. He did not pour himself any tea. Lady Cecily noticed him at 20 minutes to 4. Elizabeth watched her notice him. Watched the small pause, barely a pause, barely a hesitation, a fraction of a second in which the composed and beautiful surface of Lady Cecily flickered. Then she smoothed it back into place and turned to say something charming to the lady beside her, and the room went on. But Elizabeth had seen it. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat at 4 o'clock precisely. It was the kind of throat clearing that is not about the throat at all, and the room recognized it as such and went quiet with the slightly heightened attention of people who sense that something worth paying attention to is about to happen. "Forgive me," he said. "I wonder if I might raise a small matter. Nothing to trouble the afternoon, just a brief business item that affects several people in this room." He nodded to the solicitor. The solicitor opened his case. He produced 2 documents and set them side by side on the low table at the center of the room, where everyone could see them. "The first," Lord Pemberton said, "is the original co-trusteeship document establishing Miss Elizabeth Voss as co-trustee of the Ashford estate. The second is a document filed yesterday with the county recorder, purporting to transfer Miss Voss's portion of the trust to a third party." A pause. Purporting. The room was very still. "The second document," the solicitor said, in the dry and measured tone of a man who had spent 40 years making complicated things simple, bears Miss Voss's signature. It was filed on her behalf. The problem is that the signature does not match any verified sample of Miss Voss's hand. The date of the document places it during a period when Miss Voss's father was, verifiably, still living and present in Hampshire. And the watermark on the paper is from a batch purchased at a particular London stationer 3 months ago. He looked up. A stationer whose records show a single purchase of that paper stock, made by a customer whose name and address are on file. The quiet in the room was the particular quality of quiet that happens when 30 years of social certainty begins to shift. Lady Cecily set down her teacup. The sound it made was very small, very careful. "This is," she said, and her voice was steady, impressively steady, "a remarkable set of accusations." "They are not accusations," the solicitor said pleasantly. "They are records. I cannot imagine why anyone would suggest that I—" "No one has suggested anything," Elizabeth said. Everyone turned to look at her. She was sitting with her tea in her lap and her hands very still, and she looked at Lady Cecily with an expression that was entirely without heat, not cold, not warm, simply clear. "The records speak for themselves," Elizabeth said. "That's rather the point of records." Something moved across Lady Cecily's face. It lasted only a moment, just a flash, just a crack in the surface, 1 second where the composure slipped and what was underneath came through. Not shame, Elizabeth thought. Not quite. Something more like the particular fury of a person who has played a long and careful game and cannot understand how they lost it. Then she stood up. And she said, quietly, almost under her breath, the way people say the things they have actually been thinking when they forget for one moment to be careful about it, she said. "Your mother was a nobody." The room stopped breathing. "A gentleman's daughter with good posture and a pretty face and nothing behind it. Your father spent his whole life pretending otherwise. And you—" her voice was very controlled now and very vicious. "You have spent 2 years playing at consequence in a house you have no real right to, and I simply—" "That is enough." The Duke stood up. He said it quietly. He only said it once, but something in his voice, something Elizabeth had not heard before, a particular quality of it, something final, made Lady Cecily stop mid-sentence. He looked at her for a long moment. "You will leave this estate," he said, "before dinner." Lady Cecily stared at him. "Charles—" "Before dinner," he said, "please." The please, Elizabeth thought, was the most devastating part. It was not a concession. It was a door being closed very gently but with absolute certainty, the kind of closing that everyone in the room understood could not be reopened. Lady Cecily looked around the room, at the neighbors with their careful faces, at Lord Pemberton, who was examining the ceiling with great interest, at the solicitor, who was closing his case. at Elizabeth, who was looking at her teacup. She left without saying anything else. Her footsteps crossed the hall. The front door opened, closed. The room exhaled. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the lady from the neighboring estate said, very gently, "More tea, I think," and reached for the pot, and the room gratefully rearranged itself around the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon. Lord Pemberton caught Elizabeth's eye across the room. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He picked up his cup and looked away, but not before she saw his expression, the relief in it, the long exhale of 2 years of worry finally releasing. The Duke stood at the window for a long time after the guests left. Elizabeth was the last to go. She was gathering the cups onto the tray, old habit, the kind that 2 years had worn into her hands without her noticing, when she heard him say her name. "Miss Voss." She straightened, turned. He was still at the window, looking out at the drive where Lady Cecily's carriage had long since disappeared. His profile was very still. He looked, she thought, like a man standing at the far end of a long road he had just realized he had been walking in the wrong direction. "I owe you," he said, and then he stopped, as though the size of the thing he owed her was too large to finish the sentence with. "Yes," Elizabeth said, "you do." He turned from the window then. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had been almost looking for weeks, the way she had felt him almost looking across dining tables and corridors, and that moment in the ballroom when she had curtsied and smiled, and said, "Your Grace is too kind." "Where is Miss Voss?" he said. Elizabeth looked at him. "I beg your pardon. Last night, after I asked Mrs. Finch where you were," he said it simply, without apparent embarrassment which surprised her. "She said you'd gone to bed. I stood in the corridor for 10 minutes like an idiot." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "Why," she said carefully, "did you stand in the corridor?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her all evening, that complicated, careful look, and then he said, "Because I owed you an apology, and I didn't want to wait until morning." The fire crackled. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, just lightly, just the first tentative flakes of it, drifting past the window in the low evening light. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about a letter in her coat pocket, about her father's handwriting, about she deserves to be known, Charles, not managed, not accommodated, known. She thought about whether this moment, this man, this corridor he had stood in for 10 minutes like an idiot, was the beginning of being known, or just another thing she would have to wait out. She decided she did not yet know. But it was perhaps a beginning. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She picked up the tray and walked toward the door. "Miss Voss." She stopped, did not turn. "Tomorrow," he said, if you have time, I would like to speak with you." She stood in the doorway for a moment with the tray in her hands, and the snow falling outside the window, and 2 years of gray dresses and servants' entrances and patience. Enormous, exhausting, extraordinary patience behind her. "I have time," she said. And she walked out. She found him in the library. Or rather, she had known he would be in the library, because Mrs. Finch had told her at breakfast that he had been there since 7, and because Elizabeth had learned, over 2 years of quiet observation, that Charles Ashford went to the library when he did not know what to do with himself. It was where he had gone the morning after the dinner with the document. It was where he had gone the week Lady Cecily first arrived. It was, she suspected, where he had gone many times before Elizabeth had been paying attention. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he saw her. He was at the far end of the room, standing in front of the fireplace with a book he was not reading, and above him, above the mantel, in the heavy gilt frame that had always been there, that she had noticed on her very first day and never mentioned to anyone, was her father's portrait. Robert Voss, painted at 50 when his hair had gone silver at the temples and he had finally stopped apologizing for laughing too loudly. He looked, as he always had, like a man entirely comfortable with who he was. Elizabeth had not stood directly in front of that portrait since she arrived. She had not allowed herself to. The Duke looked up when she entered. He set the book down, carefully, spine up, the gesture of a man interrupted mid-thought rather than mid-sentence. He looked at her and then at the portrait and then back at her, and she watched him see it, the thing he should perhaps have seen much sooner, if anyone had ever given him the chance. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes, the particular way they both held their heads when they were thinking. "I used to come here," Elizabeth said before he could speak. "When I was 7, my father would bring me when he visited. He'd put me in the library with a plate of biscuits and tell me not to touch anything." She looked at the portrait. "I touched everything." The Duke said nothing. He was watching her. "He loved this house," she said. "Not the way one loves a possession, the way one loves a place that has always made them feel that things are going to be all right." She paused. "He thought it would do the same for me." She reached into her coat. She took out the letter. She held it for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight of it one last time, and then she crossed the room and placed it on the table between them. "This," she said, "was found among my father's papers. It was addressed to you. It was never delivered." He looked at it, he looked at her. "You've read it," he said. "Yes." "When?" "London 2 days ago." He was quiet. "Why didn't you show me immediately?" Elizabeth considered how to answer that. She had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in the carriage home, in the dark of her room, in the early morning before breakfast. She had prepared careful, measured responses, the kind that revealed exactly as much as she intended and no more. She decided, standing here in front of her father's portrait, that she was tired of careful and measured. "Because I needed to know," she said, "that you were capable of doing the right thing without my father asking you to. I needed to know it was you, not his voice, not his request, not his name on a piece of paper, but you making the choice yourself." She looked at him steadily. "Yesterday with Lady Cecily, that was you." He held her gaze. "Read it," she said, "please." He read it standing up. She watched him the way she had watched him read the first document, weeks ago at that desk, looking not at the page but at his face, at the small movements of it, the things that crossed it and were controlled and crossed it again anyway. He read it all the way to the end. Then he stood very still for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his expression was something she had not seen on him before, not the careful composure, not the practiced distance, not even the complicated look from the sitting room last night. Something simpler than all of that. Something that looked, she thought, rather like a man who had been handed the key to a door he had spent a long time looking for. "He called me Charles," he said. "You were boys together," Elizabeth said. "Your fathers were friends before either of you existed." "I didn't know that." "No," she said, "you weren't told." He set the letter down. He looked at the portrait. He was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth began counting the seconds out of habit, the old habit, the 2-year habit of measuring silences, of waiting. Then he said, "Did you ever think it was strange?" She looked at him. That no one explained you to me, that you arrived and were simply here and I accepted it and I never," he stopped. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "you should have." "I was told you were." "I know what you were told." "That's not an excuse." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at her directly. "I am asking you now, not because your father asked me to, not because of the documents or the trust or any of it." He paused. "Did you ever think it was strange that I never asked?" Elizabeth was still for a moment. Yes, she said quietly, every day. He nodded, once. The nod of a man receiving something he deserved and knows he deserves. I owe you, he said, an apology that is going to take considerably longer than this conversation. Yes, she said, it is. I would like the chance to make it. That, Elizabeth said, depends entirely on what you mean by it. He told her. Not in a speech she had half expected a speech, the kind of formal, prepared declaration that men of his position produced for significant moments, and she had been steeling herself against it. But it wasn't that. It was quieter than that, more halting, more honest. He told her that he had stood in the corridor for 10 minutes because he had realized, standing there, that he did not actually know her name, her full name, that he had lived in the same house as Elizabeth Voss for 2 years and introduced her to 60 people as his housekeeper and had not once, asked her about herself. He told her that Mrs. Finch had told him some months ago that Elizabeth read French and played piano and had once, at the age of 12, correctly identified a forged painting at an auction that 3 experts had missed. She told you that, Elizabeth said. She tells me a great deal, he said, with the expression of a man who has recently discovered that his housekeeper has been conducting a very patient, very long-term campaign on someone else's behalf. I begin to suspect she has been telling me things on purpose. Undoubtedly, Elizabeth said. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. Then he said, I would like to know you, if you'll allow it, not to manage the situation or resolve the legal question or, he stopped. I would simply like to know you, and I understand if 2 years is, another stop. I am not asking you to forgive anything yet. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about the gray dress, the servant's entrance, 60 heads turning. She thought about a man standing in a corridor for 10 minutes, unable to knock. She thought about her father's letter, and she deserves to be known, Charles, asterisk and the particular, devastating simplicity of being asked for nothing except to be seen. She did not forgive him, not yet. She had told Mrs. Finch that he had to earn it, all of it, every bit, and she had meant it and she still meant it. But she looked at him standing in front of her father's portrait in the library that had smelled of cedar and old paper since she was 7 years old, and she thought, all right, let's see. My name, she said, is Elizabeth Catherine Voss. My mother was Catherine Voss Caldwell of the Hampshire Caldwells. My father was Robert Voss, who sat at your father's table for 30 years and was his closest friend, and who was the finest man I have ever known. She looked at him steadily. I read French and I play piano, and I once identified a forged painting at the age of 12 that 3 experts missed. I have been living in the east wing of your house for 2 years and 4 months, and I have ordered your candles and managed your correspondence and arranged your dinner parties. And I have been patient about all of it because my father taught me that patience was a virtue, and because I believed, eventually, the truth would be sufficient. She paused. It has been sufficient, she said, but I want you to understand that I will not be managed again, by anyone. No, he said quietly, I understand that. Good. She did not say yes to anything else. She did not need to, not today. Today was not for yes or no. Today was for this. 2 people in a room that had always been hers in some way, longer than he had known it, with a portrait between them and the truth finally where it belonged. She turned to leave. Miss Voss. She stopped. What was the painting, he said, the forged one? She paused. A Flemish landscape, she said. 16th century, or so the seller claimed. The craquelure pattern was wrong, too regular. Someone had baked it. A silence. How did you know about craquelure at 12? My father's library, she said. I told you I touched everything. She walked out. Behind her she heard him make a sound, very quiet, very brief, that might, she thought, have been a laugh. 1 year later, the ballroom at Ashford was full again. Same candles, same faces, more or less, the county's finest, the neighbors, the people who had been here 12 months ago when a duke had stood before 60 guests and introduced the woman beside him as the woman who runs my household. They remembered. Of course they remembered. People in counties like this one remembered everything and repeated it often, and had been repeating this particular story for 12 months in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, and in the careful, delighted whispers of people who love nothing more than a situation that has turned itself entirely upside down. Mrs. Finch stood at the doorway to the ballroom. She had been offered, several times in the last year, a chair. She had declined every time. She intended to be standing for this. Lord Pemberton arrived early, which was unlike him, and stationed himself near the champagne, which was entirely like him. His wife stood beside him in yellow silk and watched the door with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is very nearly at the end of her waiting. Lady Hargrove arrived in deep blue, the same blue she had worn a year ago, which Elizabeth had noticed when she chose it this morning, and which Lady Hargrove had admitted when pressed was entirely intentional. Sentimental, Elizabeth had said. Profoundly, Lady Hargrove had agreed, without any apology whatsoever. The guests assembled, the candles burned, the musicians played something soft and unhurried in the corner. At 8 o'clock precisely, the doors at the top of the stairs opened. The Duke of Ashford stepped through them. He was in evening dress, which suited him, though Elizabeth had told him once, in one of the long conversations that had accumulated over the past year, in libraries and gardens, and on one memorable occasion in the kitchen at midnight when neither of them could sleep, that he looked best in the old coat he wore when he went out to look at the grounds in the morning, before the day required anything of him. He had looked startled when she said that. Then he had looked pleased. She had filed it away, that look, in the same place she filed all the things she was learning about him. The man underneath the Duke, the one who went to the library when he was uncertain and stood in corridors for 10 minutes, and had once sat in a kitchen in the evenings asking an old woman about a father he'd never known he shared with someone. He stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked out at the room, at the faces turned up toward him, at the neighbors and the cousins and the people who had been here before and remembered and were waiting. Then he looked at the woman beside him. Elizabeth stood at the top of the stairs in deep green silk with her mother's pearls and her spine very straight and her hands perfectly still, and she looked back at him, and for just a moment it was only the two of them, the rest of the room quite gone, the candles and the music and the 60 expectant faces all dissolved to nothing. He offered her his arm. She took it. He turned to the room. "Good evening," he said. "I believe most of you were here last year when I made an introduction I am not proud of." His voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "I would like to correct it now if I may." The room was perfectly silent. "This," said Charles Ashford, Duke of Ashford, "is Miss Elizabeth Catherine Voss. Her mother was Catherine Voss Caldwell of the Hampshire Caldwells. Her father was Robert Voss, one of the finest men I have ever had the privilege of knowing through the stories of those who loved him, and a man I intend to spend a considerable time making it up to." His voice did not waver. "She is co-trustee of this estate. She is my guest, in the house that was always as much hers as mine. She is the granddaughter of Admiral Caldwell, the daughter of a scholar and a gentleman, and she is—" He paused. "Just briefly, just long enough. She is the woman I intend to marry if she'll have me, which she has not yet confirmed. So if anyone has any thoughts on how to be persuasive, I'm open to suggestions." The room broke. Not into scandal, into something warmer than that. The particular sound of 60 people who have been holding their breath for 12 months all releasing it at once. Lord Pemberton raised his glass so fast, he spilled half of it and did not notice. His wife covered her mouth with both hands. Lady Hargrove produced a fan from somewhere and applied it vigorously to her face, which Elizabeth happened to know was her method of avoiding crying in public, a method that had never once worked. Elizabeth looked at none of them. She looked at Charles. He was looking back at her with an expression she had learned over the past year to read quite precisely. The one that appeared when he was trying very hard to be composed and was not entirely succeeding, which happened, she had discovered, more often than anyone who only knew him formally would ever suspect. She thought about her father's letter. She deserves to be known. She thought about a girl of 7 in a library with a plate of biscuits, who had touched everything and been entirely unrepentant about it. She thought about the gray dress, folded at the back of the wardrobe where she had put it 12 months ago and not touched since, not thrown away, because she was not sentimental about the wrong things, but kept, because she believed in remembering the distance between where you had been and where you were. She looked at Charles Ashford, who had stood in a corridor for 10 minutes and asked about Crackalure, and sat in libraries when he was uncertain, and had just announced his intentions to 60 people, while freely admitting she hadn't said yes yet. She gave him the same small, controlled smile she had given the room a year ago. Except this time he knew exactly what it meant. She leaned close enough that only he could hear. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I'll consider it." He looked at her. "Tonight. If you're brave enough." He was quiet for exactly 1 second. "I stood in a corridor for 10 minutes, he said. "I think we've established that I have a certain kind of stubborn courage." Elizabeth laughed. She hadn't meant to, it came out before she could arrange her face, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she had not laughed in 2 years and 4 months, and that felt now like something coming back to life. She felt him look at her when she laughed, felt the quality of it, the careful, intent, particular attention of a man storing something away. She deserves to be known. "All right, Papa," she thought very quietly to the portrait in the library down the hall. "All right." Mrs. Finch at the doorway smiled so wide it nearly broke her face. Lord Pemberton was attempting to refill his glass, and mostly missing. Lady Hargrove's fan had given up entirely. The musicians, taking their cue from the room, shifted into something warmer and more celebratory, and the candles burned, and the snow fell soft and unhurried outside the long windows of Ashford, and the evening went on. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.